Growing Old, Black and Enslaved, United States, 1865. The year 1865 marks one of the most crucial moments in American history, when the Civil War was coming to an end, and with it, the institution that had enslaved millions of Africans and their descendants for more than 2 centuries. But to truly understand the horror of black slavery in the United States, we need to look beyond the battles and decrees. We need to enter the daily reality of those black men and women who lived their entire lives in chains, who were born, worked, and grew old under the brutal yoke of human property, based solely on the color of their skin. Growing old as an enslaved black person in the United States was not simply a matter of passing years. It was a journey through progressive layers of racial exploitation, abandonment, and dehumanization that reveal the systematic cruelty of this institution founded on racism and white supremacy. When a black child was born enslaved on an American plantation, their destiny was already sealed before the first cry. They would grow up working to enrich white men, and would continue working until their body simply could no longer generate profit for their white owners. There was no retirement, there was no well-deserved rest, there was no dignity in old age for an enslaved black person. At 40 years old, an enslaved black man or woman was already considered old by the standards of the time, because the brutal work in cotton, tobacco, and sugarcane fields, chronic malnutrition, inhumane living conditions in the slave quarters, and the total absence of adequate medical care for blacks dramatically accelerated the aging process. Black bodies that should be in full vital force at 40 already exhibited the marks of decades of relentless racial exploitation, backs curved by the weight of endless harvests under the scorching southern sun, black hands deformed by repetitive work without rest, lungs compromised by inhaling cotton dust on the plantations, and scars that told stories of whippings and violence that no human being should endure, but which were routine for blacks under the dominion of white masters. White farmers, slave owners, saw their black captives exclusively through the lenses of economic productivity and racial inferiority. An enslaved black person had value as long as they could produce, work, generate profit for the white man. When age began to take its toll and the black person's work capacity diminished, a cold and inhumane calculation began about what to do with that depreciated black property. Some white farmers, especially on the large cotton plantations of the Deep South, where the economy depended entirely on black slave labor, simply continued extracting work until the last drop of vital force from these black men and women, assigning elderly enslaved blacks tasks that, although less strenuous than field work, were still exhausting for black bodies worn down by a lifetime of servitude. Caring for small black children, feeding animals, mending clothes for other enslaved people, preparing food in the kitchens of the big white houses, cleaning facilities, all these were tasks assigned to elderly blacks who could no longer keep up with the brutal pace of cotton harvests. The practice of selling elderly enslaved blacks reveals a particularly cruel face of the racist system. When a white farmer considered that an enslaved black person no longer had sufficient productive value to justify the minimum maintenance costs, sale became an attractive option. Specialized white traders bought elderly enslaved black people for paltry prices, frequently separating them from black families with whom they had lived for decades. These desperate sales happened at public auctions, where black men and women who had dedicated their entire lives to enriching white families were examined like cattle, their teeth checked by white buyers, their black muscles palpated, while white farmers made bids that were no more than a few $dozen. Before we continue with this difficult but important history, if you're finding this content valuable and want to see more historical documentaries like this, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our upcoming videos. Your support helps us continue bringing these untold stories to light. The fate of these sold elderly blacks was uncertain and frequently tragic. Many ended up on even more brutal farms where they were literally worked to death, their black bodies buried in mass graves without even a marker. In the extreme southern states, where cotton and sugarcane plantations demanded intense labor from hundreds of enslaved blacks, there was an even more sinister practice known as retirement to the swamp or abandonment in back cabins. Enslaved blacks who could no longer work were simply sent to isolated cabins in swampy or remote areas of the property, where they received minimal food rations, usually leftovers, or spoiled food that whites would not eat. There, abandoned to their own devices, without medical care, without adequate shelter, many elderly blacks died of starvation, disease, or exposure to the elements within weeks or months. This was a form of slow and deliberate extermination of the black population considered unproductive, a way for white masters to rid themselves of the burden of blacks they had exploited for a lifetime without having to bear maintenance costs or face any moral responsibility. Some properties maintained what they called a hospital or infirmary for blacks, but these places were rarely spaces of healing. They were actually human warehouses, where sick and elderly blacks were confined, frequently in deplorable conditions that no white person would tolerate, without real medical treatment, just waiting for death. White doctors, when called, rarely cared about the well-being of black patients, seeing them as objects of study for medical experimentation or simply refusing to spend valuable resources on black property that no longer had productive value. The mortality rate in these infirmaries was frighteningly high, and many enslaved blacks preferred to hide their illnesses and continue working rather than be sent to these places from which few blacks returned alive. Family dynamics within enslaved black communities added another layer of tragedy to the aging experience. Enslaved black families developed deep bonds despite the systematic efforts of white masters to prevent such connections, maintaining African traditions mixed with new practices developed in captivity. But aging frequently resulted in brutal separations. When an elderly black person was sold or sent to die in isolation, black children, grandchildren, companions and friends were forced to witness the destruction of their loved ones without being able to do absolutely anything to prevent white cruelty. Black grandparents who had played crucial roles in transmitting African knowledge, stories of the homeland, survival techniques and black cultural identity were torn from the community, taking with them irreplaceable memories and wisdom about Africa and about resistance. Domestic work in the big houses of whites frequently assigned to older blacks was presented by white masters as a form of benevolence, recognition for years of faithful service. In reality, it was just another form of racial exploitation. Elderly black cooks worked in suffocating kitchens from before dawn until late at night, preparing elaborate meals for white families, while they themselves survived on leftovers that not even the whites' pigs would eat. Elderly black nannies cared for white children with tenderness that their own enslaved black grandchildren would never receive, forced to breastfeed white babies while their own black children worked in the fields, forced to demonstrate affection and dedication to the children of their white oppressors. Elderly black butlers and personal servants were constantly at the disposal of white whims, their painful black bodies having to maintain appearances of dignity and efficiency to satisfy every demand of their white owners, always remembering their inferior place in the racial hierarchy. If you're still watching and learning from this documentary, I want to personally thank you for taking the time to understand this painful chapter of history. If you haven't subscribed yet, now would be a great time to do so. We have many more documentaries exploring untold stories from history, and your subscription really makes a difference in helping us reach more people with this important content. The arrival of 1865 brought seismic changes to the nation, but for elderly enslaved blacks, freedom came too late or simply never arrived in any meaningful way. Many blacks died in the first months of 1865, before the 13th Amendment was ratified in December, working until their last breath to enrich white men. Those blacks who survived to see abolition faced a new set of challenges in a still deeply racist society. Decades of forced labor had destroyed their black bodies. They had no savings. They had no land that whites had stolen from them. They had nothing but the tattered clothes they wore. The white society that had exploited them for their entire lives offered no reparations, pensions, or any form of assistance to formerly enslaved blacks. Many elderly blacks continued working on the same plantations of white owners under sharecropping and tenant farming systems that were slavery by another name. Because they had no alternatives in an economy controlled by whites, their specific skills were products of a lifetime of coercion and did not easily translate into economic autonomy in a country hostile to free blacks. Historical records preserve devastating accounts of elderly enslaved blacks who described their experiences decades after abolition. They spoke of nights without adequate sleep, because their black bodies hurt too much from beatings and forced labor, of constant hunger even when there was food because their stomachs were ruined by years of inadequate nutrition that whites provided them, of perpetual fear of whites that never left them even after freedom. Elderly blacks spoke of watching black friends and family members die of exhaustion in cotton fields, of being forced to continue working while burying their black dead in shallow graves, of whippings received from white overseers when their tired black bodies slowed the pace, of elderly black women raped by white masters even in old age. These narratives of formerly enslaved blacks, collected by historians and the Works Progress Administration in the 1930s, offer painful windows into a reality of black slavery that no official document could completely capture. The intersection of aging, race, and slavery reveals perhaps the cruelest face of this racist institution. If slavery stole the youth, productivity, family, and dignity of blacks, aging under slavery stole even the hope of a final rest for these black men and women. There was no light at the end of the tunnel for an enslaved black person, no promise that racial suffering would eventually end, only the certainty that each day would be harder than the previous one until death finally brought relief from the white yoke. White masters who boasted of their Christian piety, who built magnificent churches and professed family values, demonstrated the deepest hypocrisy when they denied basic humanity to the blacks, who had built their fortunes with their own African blood and sweat. When we think of 1865 and the abolition of black slavery, we must remember that for millions of black people, especially the elderly who had spent their entire lives in captivity since they were torn from Africa or were born on American soil to enslaved African parents, freedom came when their best years had already been stolen by whites, when their black bodies were already broken beyond repair, when their black families had already been destroyed by the slave trade. The true measure of the cruelty of black slavery in the United States is not only in the whips and chains that bound blacks, but in the systematic theft of entire black lives from childhood to old age, without remorse from whites, without compensation for blacks, without justice. Growing old as an enslaved black person in the United States in 1865 meant having survived the unthinkable, only to face abandonment, continued exploitation by whites, or death in misery, a final testament to the racial inhumanity that defined this dark era of American history, and whose effects on the black population still reverberate to this day. Thank you for watching this documentary on the harsh reality of aging under slavery in 1865. These stories need to be told and remembered so that we never forget this dark chapter of human history. If this video impacted you or taught you something new, please show your support by subscribing to our channel, giving this video a thumbs up, and sharing it with others who should hear these important stories. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you'll be the first to know when we release our next historical documentary. Your engagement helps us continue this important work of preserving and sharing these voices from history. See you in the next video.